I haven't scripted this, so who knows what's going to happen. So yeah, just want to say the past month, a little over a month now, has been just not the best. Insert picture of our car. I've also been working on making stuff. So, I mean, it has not been entirely unproductive. I will actually hopefully do a video on these before my customer comes to pick them up. These are early 18th century breeches. The style, though, does date to the 1680s, 1690s. So the other week I tried to do a live stream on pirate weapons. Among weapons of the golden age of piracy were firearms. YouTube has a policy that you cannot have firearms on a live stream. I did not know this. I apologize. There have been a few live streams in the past that either I have been a part of or have watched where the presenter had a firearm in their hands. I mean, in fact, this one comes to mind. In a live stream and nothing happened. YouTube never did anything. I don't know why the algorithm went after me that day, but it did. For some of you, I know some of you are probably going, well, that's an obvious thing given YouTube's policies. We need to add some clarification on this, and this is very important to reenactors, historians, etc., when dealing with historical firearms in a social media context, even in a public context, a live public context. Disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. If before you do anything related to things that go boom, you need to check your local laws, ordinances, etc. If you're working with a historic site, you need to ask them. Just ask them, like, hey, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I bring that? Just ask. Alright. We're going to talk about the practical issues when it comes to black powder firearms. So, reenacting history, etc. Alright, let's talk about New York. So, about 2 years ago, it's either 1 or 2 years ago, I actually forget at this point, New York passed a law which banned firearms in more locations. They didn't get very detailed in what was banned, and this is an important thing that when you're writing a law or a rule you need to actually clarify. For those not from the United States, typically black powder firearms, to include cannons, are not considered firearms when it comes to legal statutes. Again, you need to pay attention to your state. You need to pay attention to your local community, but on the federal level, this is just metal. Now, if it was used to commit a crime, yes, then the laws change on that. It'd be the same as a steak knife. So, New York passes this rule, and they, again, did not clarify things. New York has a very, very strong tourist industry, especially when it comes to history. New York's a site of several very important battles, the American Revolution, French and Indian War, and they have a lot of very large reenactments. They also have a lot of smaller historic sites that rely on the presence of reenactors to help generate more revenue. The problem is this law gets passed. Nobody, as member of staff, as sitting in office, thought about the words. A lot of people who make laws, this is not me saying this as a political point, this is me saying this to somebody who studies laws historically. A lot of people who make laws tend to make laws without fully understanding what they are talking about. I'm not going to get specific on it, but it makes me cringe as a historian a lot of times when you'll hear something referencing early English common law from like the 17th century, and it's like, do you understand the context of that law and who made it? Well, immediately historians, historic sites, reenactors were reaching out like, hey, does this mean this event's canceled? I'm going to an event on a federal site. Is that event canceled? We've been doing the state event for years. Is this canceled? I mean, we're not just talking about muskets here. We're talking about cannons, too. Like, I mean, what's going on, New York? Immediately, the governor responds like, hey, whoa, whoa, we forgot about historic sites. We need to write in a provision. Listen, our bad. You can still bring your guns to historic sites, just not the modern ones. Oh, and if it's within a historic setting, some of the modern ones, like it was very confusing. I don't deal with the modern stuff so much, so I can't tell you much how that ended up on that front. There's still reenactments in New York. There's still parades that people participate in within New York City itself. For those of you who have stuck around, I will probably repeat this again. Most of the weapons reenactors carry in the United States, actually to a good extent in Europe for that matter, are not fakes. They are real. Some of them might be modified so that they cannot function with live rounds, but a lot of what's done to modify them can be reversed legally, depending on country, or in the case of the United States, actually Great Britain, I think, you have to I forget the licensing you guys get, but yeah, this is real, this is functional. If I was doing a live, I couldn't actually hold this. Needless to say, I did several events that year in New York City. There was never an issue. At one of the events, the local police department showed up just to take pictures with us. I had a cut-down Brown Bess musket, which the police were extremely happy to hold and get pictures with. And I mean, this is like, depending on how you read some of the laws, it technically was illegal, but because of its historic context, it was not. Context is very important. Actually, the first time I went to New York to do an event, I knew at that point in time I could bring my musket, no issue. What I got concerned about was my pocket knife. This knife was about, I think about a half an inch to an inch too long for New York City laws. So I ended up cutting off the tip of it. Makes a great sailor knife. Yeah, that's the nitty-gritty of some of the issues with some of the laws. It's confusing. Some of what I can do in real life in states that are very anti-gun, I can't do on YouTube. For instance, I could take apart a mechanism, show you how it works, and not worry about any sort of legal repercussions in New York. On YouTube, If the algorithm's having a bad mood that day, I could get in trouble for it. There are certain words that I can say at historic sites when it pertains to pirate weapons. I cannot say those words on YouTube, again, because the algorithm might be having a rough day. I should also, now that this is out of the way, and this, I have to admit it, the politics are going to weasel their way into some of this discussion today only by a matter of necessity. So the first weapon I had wanted to talk about was the dog-lock musket. So the first locks when it came to firearms, was basically taking a stick with a piece of lit cord and pressing it to a fuse hole, a touch hole. Boom. Then they started adding trigger systems. You get some of the early match locks. People were trying to figure out more safe ways of doing it. That didn't involve holding a piece of fire while you're pouring powder. So then it evolves into things like the wheel lock. The wheel lock is fired by a spinning wheel with a piece of pyrite. Makes a really nice spark. It goes boom. The issue with wheel locks, they are very fragile. They are very complicated. They are not something that, if you're on a ship for a long time, out with the salt, and if you're a buccaneer, you're going inland and you're in the mud, you don't want something like that. Yes, they were a lot more reliable than a flintlock, but they also took longer to load, and again, they were very complicated. One of the big sticking points with historical firearms people is when it comes to us, some of us who are gunsmiths. YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook's weird with it too. Like I said, there's a lot of vagueness. We're not allowed to post making videos. The thing with wheel locks, and this is true in the time period, especially like you're talking late 17th century, wheel locks are outdated. Victorian era, they are way outdated, but during that entire time period, that's like approximately 400 years of wheel locks up into the present, they are seen as a very nice status item. It takes a lot of work to make. It's something that you as a maker want to show off. It's something you as an owner want to show off. Making them is an art form. You're dealing with springs. You're thinking a lot more about watch technology, like pocket watch technology, as opposed to firearms technology. Forgotten Weapons, I forget how many years ago, I'll post a link in the description, did an excellent comparison of, yes, I'm talking about Gun Jesus for those who are unfamiliar. He did a awesome comparison of a historical, they're both historical, that's the problem. One was from, I want to say, the early 17th century. I'm probably wrong, it might be 16th century. And a 19th century Victorian made two different wheel locks. It's an amazing video. Definitely check it out if you're interested in this sort of thing. But would a pirate have a wheel lock? Maybe. As a status item? Oh yeah. Something that they're planning on selling later? Definitely. I mean, it's something that they could get money for. The right person, yeah, they'll pay them for it. Would they carry it as a primary, this is going to protect me weapon? More than likely not. This is what's called an English lock. It's also a snap lock. Basically, geographic location and the dog are all that really make this an English lock. I've also seen them described as a Jacobean lock. These would have been common among colonists. They would have been one of the first non-matchlock type locks that would have been common in military service. These are reproductions, so a lot of them have added safety features. In the original, you would not have that. That's called the half cock. I can't fire it. I can put the steel down and nothing's happening. In the original, I wouldn't have that position. I would have to either have it fully cocked or, in the case of using a dog, you could have the dog, which again is a safety catch. I have to get it. There we go. Boom. Alright. If you look very closely, you can see where the spring is where the sear is sticking out. There's a problem with that. That's on the outside. If you bump this into something, it's going to fire. These started to be banned in colonial militias, actually even in the colonies themselves in the late 17th century. I have not seen anything specifically. I need to do more research on it. I do not know if English locks that had a safety catch were also banned. But it was a safety reason. You wanted your militia to be able to fire it when they needed to, but you also didn't want them going around without the ability to be half-cocked. That's where we actually get that term, by the way. But yeah, that's the English lock / snap lock. Snap locks, the snap-haunts, they would carry on into the 18th century in Southern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. You still see some of them being made into the 19th century, depending on country. I mean, it's a simple lock. It works. It does its job. It just, from a military context, was a little unsafe. Then we have the Flintlock. The Flintlock's great because, from the beginning, it had a half cock. And it's full cock. This is what really set the pirates and the indigenous communities in New England apart from the colonial militias. They were using this technology while a lot of the militias were using matchlocks. This is a more reliable system. It allowed them to have a higher rate of fire. And generally speaking, the weapons were better made. In the case of Native Americans, they were getting a lot of these from Dutch traders. In the case of buccaneers, they were getting them from French traders, Dutch traders, and they were tactically acquiring them. There were flintlocks being made in England. Flintlocks go back right at the beginning of the 17th century. I mean, they weren't a new system even in the time period we're talking about. They just were not yet common when it came to militaries. The militaries were going with what was cheaper. Matchlocks were a lot cheaper than flintlocks. Over time, the utility of the flintlock became more valuable than any of the cheapness the matchlock offered. Now, some of you are probably like, well, where's the dog lock? Dog lock is basically a flintlock with an added safety. So, in the time period, again, some of these were snap locks. But some of them did have the half cock. Even if there's an issue with the trigger, that dog, that's what this catch is called, a dog, is still going to hold it back. These continue to be made in Scandinavian countries as military arms into the 19th century. They were very popular. The English decided, though, that, you know, just having a half cock saves us a little bit of money on this little piece of metal. There's less time to thread this area, less time to make. Keep in mind, you're making every single piece of this by hand. You might have some set guidelines, but everything you're making is by hand. Yes, this is a tiny piece, but you're threading it. You're making every individual part for it. That's time and money. If you notice, the stock is not the fancier stocks that you see in some of the other muskets of the time period. It's just a simple military stock. If you were a buccaneer, a pirate, yeah, you could very likely have something like this. If you were colonial militia later on in the 17th century, yeah, you'd have something like this. You see some of these being made up into the early part of King George's reign. An interesting thing about some of the early commission muskets, like we're talking pre-land muskets, which today we call them Brown Bess, you will notice there'll be sometimes a hole right here that was never used, but it was set up to be a dog lock, and they just never added the dog to it. These sometimes fall off pretty easily. I know quite a few reenactors who have a dog lock without a dog. They still work, they still function, and it is historically correct. So another one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why are these muskets so long? Now keep in mind, this is a military issue musket. This is not even a fowling piece or a boucanier gun. This is just a basic musket. This would have been, in overall form, this would have been your standard in a military setting. If you were civilian militia, you might have something similar. This, at 45 inches barrel length, this is on the lower end of a buccaneer gun. Some of them would get upwards of about 70 inches. Around 50, 60, in that ballpark is where most of your buccaneer guns are going to be. So, that barrel length gives you more velocity. It gives you time for more of the powder to burn up. Black powder is slower burning than modern powder. That said, some of you who have experience with the shorter end of modern weapons are very familiar with there being a bigger flash with a shorter weapon. The reason being, a lot of the powder does not burn up inside of the barrel. It will end up burning up outside. That's why people will look at, like, if any of you are familiar with the Obrez, people will look at that and go, oh my gosh, that'd break your wrist. No, it wouldn't. It would probably just blind you and set somebody on fire in front of you. You're running into the same thing with black powder firearms, even more so because, again, it's a slower burn rate. So with a buccaneer gun, some of the fowling pieces, you're getting a lot more time for the powder to burn up to increase the velocity. That increased velocity will help with accuracy, especially when you're talking about some of the barrel lengths with buccaneer guns. That's why, although it's a smoothbore weapon, there's no rifling, you're still having conversations about accuracy. When talking about muskets of the time period, you're not just talking about a point target. A point target is what you're aiming at. You're also going to be talking about an area target. So it might not hit what you're aiming at, but it will hit in a certain area with lethal force. So when you're talking some of these, when you're talking about some of the military units forming up, they're aiming for an area target, which would be that other line forming up. With pirates, you're not getting that. Unless it's a crowded deck, and you're a buccaneer in a boat. If you're loading a smooth bore a certain way every single time, in the case of buccaneers, they're using preloaded cartridges. If you're making sure everything is correct, you will develop a certain amount of consistency. No, you probably will not be modern level accurate, like with a modern rifle, but you will be a lot more accurate than the militias at the time period. So one of the topics that comes up with the difference between a buccaneer gun and, let's say, a fowling piece, in some cases there's really no difference. Just location it was made and the purpose. A fowling piece, your goal is to shoot at waterfowl with shot, which would be small pellets. Some people have talked about, well, wouldn't they, with a buccaneer gun, would you be able to load multiple shots like that? Yeah, you could. That's, again, where some of the problems lie, because the difference tends to be very subtle. Some of the shapes that you get with, like, the club butt, you see that in fowling pieces, you see it in buccaneer guns. In certain militia records up into the American Revolution, you will see maybe a fowling piece referenced or a buccaneer gun referenced. They were still being used up into the American Revolution. Buccaneer guns were very popular in the colonies, not just among buccaneers. They made a great fowling piece because of their accuracy. They were great for things like deer. You wouldn't really want to go after small game with them, though, because another commonality with buccaneer guns, they tend to be about, I'm going to say about 69 caliber or higher. So between 69 and 75. I mean, you're talking, well, this is the exact, this is technically a little bigger because it's designed to, this is a Tampion. I'm pretty sure the similar sounding word is actually related. Do not quote me on that. It might be a false cognate, I'm not sure. But, I mean, you're talking about getting hit with a lead ball that size. It's gonna hurt. And if you're taking that same size and replacing with shot, or a ball and shot, or two balls, depending upon what you're aiming at, your chance of hitting the target, the chances of dropping the target, they increase. One was the plug bayonet. Basically, you're plugging your barrel with a knife. This was also the time period we started seeing the early socket bayonets. Part of understanding what time period a musket comes from, around the time of Queen Anne, even though these muskets are routinely marketed as a Queen Anne musket, they're not. They're more of a King James musket or a King William musket. Around the time of King William and Queen Anne, you start seeing this part of the stock cut off. And what happens is that front sight, you're able to mount a socket. It allows you to still fire the musket while at the same time having a bayonet. These would become the norm. I mean, the Soviet Union was still issuing socket bayonets during World War II. So, yeah, I mean, it became a very popular bayonet form. The knife style of bayonet comes back in the 19th century. It's what we have today on modern military weapons. All they did was take the guard add a hole in the middle of it, and then have a locking mechanism on the barrel and on the knife itself. Oh, because I'm pretty sure somebody will ask at some point, what is this cover for? Number one, it's to stop fouling on the steel, or frizzen. Time period it was typically called a steel. Frizzen's a later term. Some people say you could put it on your thumb, and I've never done it. I usually just have it there to stop moisture from getting to the steel. It does also work as an extra level of safety. So if we're doing something where we're doing a firing presentation and we've loaded them but we're not ready to discharge them yet, it's both at half cock and it has this. It makes things a lot safer. Let's talk about pistols. So, this is a holster pistol. I mean, compared to me, it's pretty big. The balance is not that bad. If you notice the grip, it allows you to have a straight line, fairly straight line. These were designed to be used by cavalry, basically. You would ride up on your horse, you might have one or two of these, you would fire in the general area, holster it, and ride away. These were popular during the English Civil War, and pistols of this general type continue to be used. I mean, they were still issuing similar examples, of course, updated, different grip style, different lock style, into the American Civil War. They tend to be of a higher caliber than a normal smaller pistol, or again, they might have a longer barrel, which increases velocity. These were actually popular with Dutch sailors, the larger horse pistol style. You see larger pistols in wreck sites. Were they popular? Yeah. Would a pirate have them? Yeah. I mean, they're documented. Would they have the holster? That's where there's a lot of debate about it. A lot of the engravings which show holsters being used by pirates are a little bit after the golden age of piracy. That said, would pirates have possibly used holsters? As long as you're using a style of holster that is documented at the time period, I don't see an issue with it. There's a term used in the military that's called field expedience. Reenactors sometimes use it a little too liberally, but for certain time periods where we don't have solid documentation, sometimes if you see a safety need or a practical need, very likely the people in the time period saw the same thing. That said, according to the general history of pirates, I know we shouldn't trust it that great, a silk sling would be used for some pistols. The Witterwreck has an example of a silk piece of cloth being found with a pistol. I've mentioned before, one of my big concerns with the way the artifact is presented, we don't actually see how this piece of silk was attached. There's a possibility that they were found together, but might not have actually been connected to each other. I really wish the widow would provide a little bit more documentation on that. Barry Clifford is a big fan of the general history of pirates, so he does have some level of bias with that. That said, I mean, I don't see an issue with it. It makes practical sense. Would it be attached to the grip? Would it be attached to the trigger guard? We don't have any evidence to which. I tried it on the grip and I found that it would be too loose and ran the risk of it dropping, which I'm not an actual pirate, so I can't just go raid another ship and get a new one. So I attached it to the trigger guard, which it's a lot safer. Also, you typically do not carry these loaded in a reenactment setting, especially this way. Again, safety. So this is one that we get a lot of questions about. Why is it called a Queen Anne pistol? Well, these became very popular around the time of Queen Anne. That said, they actually predate Queen Anne's reign. I mean, I see different numbers, 1670s, 1680s, but the 1680s images of the Buccaneers, they have what looks to be one of these. These would have been called a turn-off pistol. The ones, I don't know if I can actually say the maker. Actually, can I say the maker? By a very well-known Italian maker. I can't say it because that might count as marketing, where to get it. I don't want to get banned by YouTube. They do not include the turn-off feature. There are several other reproductions that do have it. One of them tends to be a little too big, and the other one is by a very small maker in another English-speaking country that you would not think has gun makers. But they're very pricey, but they are very, very nice looking. These fit in a jacket pocket, some of the trouser pockets. I mean, that's why they were popular. You see the same style being used well into the 19th century. Some of them are mostly metal right here. In that case, they can also be called a box lock. This style, you see both styles early on. So the grip shape barely changes. It's one of the few consistencies of weapons from the 17th into the 19th century. Typically, if I saw a grip shape on this, like this, on a regular flintlock, I'd say, oh, that's a little bit later. In the case of a Queen Anne, that's typically how they looked. Again, a lot of it was for concealment. Did pirates have them? This is actually one of the few pistols I can say, yeah, there's images. In the case of, now, I don't have other flintlock pistols to show off. They vary a lot. A lot of flintlock weapons, a lot of firearms from the 17th century up into the 19th century, you see them get refitted, reused. A lot of the terminology we use to describe them, it's actually, blame the Victorians for it. Even modern people, we like to have that, we like to have a way to categorize things. So some of the pistol types that we see, you might see the same thing later on, even into the 19th century. You gotta look for subtle design differences. Again, a problem with the Queen Anne pistols, you have this sort of floral flourish on the side. Some of them you might see little designs, but this shape of the brass plate right here, you see it very consistently with Queen Anne pistols throughout their whole existence. A grotesque, that's a very popular Baroque motif. You see it on swords. You see it on Queen Anne pistols. Even though I believe this one's a copy, I want to say, of a 1760s example, it's very consistent with the 17th century as well. Some of the reproductions that are presently available and commonly available of pistols from the 17th century, I'm a little unhappy with some of their shapes. I cannot name specifically which makers, where to get them, etc. But if you do a quick Google search and look at some of the images of current made ones, they're clunky. I like this. I like how this one was made by one of those makers, because the shape is actually right. It doesn't have some weird bump right here. The wood would have been thick because this was also meant to be a club. Hence the metal plate. So if you fired that shot and you didn't have a blade handy, you could just whip it around and now you have a club. It needs to be noted that how these were carried by pirates, these would have been used by the left hand. These would not have been your main hand. The main hand would have access to the sword. The left hand would have access to the pistols. The musket would be right-handed, but you wouldn't necessarily carry it onto the ship. Now let's get into swords. I can get into a lot more detail about swords without YouTube getting angry. Actually, wait, before we do that, let's talk about the next few things that I can talk about only vaguely because of YouTube. The spicy baseballs. So, there were glass ones in the time period. Would they have been made out of clear glass? Most likely not. There were also ceramic examples. Did clear glass exist? Yes. It tended to be very expensive though. But I have this one mainly just to show the public. One day I might see if I can get one that's more properly made to the style of the time period. Walking up to a glass blower and saying, hey, can you make me a 17th century spicy baseball? Not many of them typically do that. A lot of your glass in the time period tended to be a little bit thicker than what we think of with modern glass today. It would have provided some level of security. The glass itself would act as shrapnel, plus you could put pointy things inside of it. Try not to get YouTube angry. What's inside this one's actually coffee. I had dried out coffee grounds. I'm like, yeah, just use that. Also have some random bits of metal in there as well. But ceramic would be very similar. They did have incendiary versions, which were designed to break on the deck of a ship. There are various mixtures that could be used. A lot of them included pitch. Somebody asked in the comments about using alcohol. The alcohol of the time period would vary in proof strength. There were some ways of testing it, but overall you might not get something that would actually burn. A lot of your proofs were likely around 80 proof or so, which a lot of the proofs in that time period were around 80 proof. 80 proof doesn't typically burn. 80 proof's what you normally get at a liquor store today, unless you're looking for something a little bit higher. There was a rum in Jamaica called Kill Devil, which might have been stronger. That might have been able to catch on fire. The problem is, people drank the stuff, so we don't have that many surviving examples. I do want to eventually do a video on alcohol of the time period. You're running into a lot of issues with the quality of the distillers. Yeah. So, this style would have been made out of cast iron. I mentioned in a short video, I tend to make these out of plastic, soft plastic. The reason being, when these are on a display table, or I might hand one to a person, a lot of people do not realize how heavy cast iron is. they'll see something like this and pick it up like it's a baseball, not realizing it's a little bit heavier. And there's this brief moment of their brain trying to contact their hand, and their hand being and it can fall and potentially break toes. And I know some of you, well, why do you let people get so close to the table? Ask any of your historical friends, people who've worked in museums, people who work for historic sites, reenactors. Ask them about the general public sometime. People end up you'll have something marked off and people will just randomly appear behind it. We've had to rope off fire already because people were trying to play with the fire. We're talking grown-ups. Grown adults were trying to play with the fire. I didn't know it was real. I'm not kidding. I wish I was kidding. I had been planning on doing a Halloween video. I still might do that video. It just won't be a Halloween video, sadly. There's a lot of stories. But, yeah. These function the same way as modern spicy baseballs do. You would have to light it with a slow match. This would be a quick match, and you throw it. They were very popular in the 17th and 18th century. They started to be used less and less in the later part of the 18th century, to the point that the term grenadier became more of a symbolic term and not an actual practical term. And then during World War I, these became very popular again. Some of them made originally the same way. This is a reproduction. This does not function. Algorithm, do not hurt me. As you can see, this pin acts as a safety for the spoon. When you remove that, this pops forward, the spoon itself goes flying, it releases a spring-loaded percussive device which causes the spicy baseball to become spicier. This you can carry around with minimal safety issues. This you have to carry it with something that's burning. So a piece of slow match. One of the questions sometimes people ask about Blackbeard is why would he have slow matches? First of all, we are not sure he actually did, but having it around your hat would keep it out of your hands, and it would allow you to use these. So there is a practical reason why that could have been a thing. When you're operating on a ship, actually any kind of mechanical vehicle, you want your hands free, so you can navigate your way around. A slow match, you can't stick it in your pocket, you can't stick it in your clothing. I mean, you might be able to put it around your arm, but you're still running the risk of bumping it into things. That would make practical sense to me. Did he actually do it? We don't know. There's also a video that periodically gets tossed around. I hate questioning other historians. You don't light these before putting them against powder. Alright? For those of you who get weird ideas, again, you need to pay attention that this is, if this was real, it would have to be registered. Yes, it could actually, I could have a real functional one, but it would have to be registered. I could have one for the cannons as well, but the cannon itself would be legal. That part, if it contains spicy powder, would have to be registered. You'd have to have special licensing for it, everything else. The video talks about grenade launchers from the time period. Yes, they did exist. Most of the time they were used for signaling. They would be used to launch basically fireworks. You could also use them for celebrations and launch fireworks. You would not light it before putting it in. I know somebody's probably going to go, why wouldn't you? Because you're going to be sitting it against gunpowder. So if you lit that, put that in, and it rolls or a little bit of the sparks come off of it, it's going to make the gunpowder prematurely detonate. with your hand right there. You didn't do that. The gunpowder on its own, again, it's slow burning. It would ignite it, and hopefully, if everything functioned right, would get it far enough away from you that it wouldn't cause you a problem. Were there sometimes problems? Yes, and that's why throughout the whole time period, well into the modern era, there have been different attempts at making a timed fuse that was more precise. Some of these fuses might burn a little bit faster than others. There was no consistency with it. So you might think you have a certain amount of time, when in actuality, because of the maker, this might end up going off too quickly or too slowly. Since we're on the topic of ordnance, since we're on the topic of cannons and things like this, the primary use for spherical shot was not to have it hit and make a boom. It was to be overhead and make a boom. That's why it was used in a naval context every now and then, because it could hit rigging and it could hit the people below. So in the case of these, you wanted it away from you. It didn't matter what it did after that. Preferably, it would be among those that were defending the ship you were going after. I hope I explained that without being too confusing. Again, I do not want to anger the algorithm. Before I continue on to non-boomy devices, let's talk a little bit more about the accessories that you would have with pistols, long arms, etc. In some of the Buccaneer images, some of the later pirate images, we see various sorts of pouches. This one's replicated from the image of Henry Every. I believe that was from about 1730 or so, but you see similar examples in the Buccaneer images. This would be used to carry possibly cartridges, possibly shot. I typically use it to carry tools for my musket and pistols, such things as a powder measure, various cleaning tools, turn screw. This one actually has a vent pick, a very important thing when dealing with black powder, which fouls quite a bit. An oil bottle, which luckily is not filled with oil because I just realized the cork fell off. Spare paper cartridges, etc. Somebody asked in one of the... Somebody asked, actually, I believe it was in Golden Gunpowder's live stream the other day, about paper cartridges. Well, this type of box, there's examples that have been found on the Phipps wreck and the Witter wreck. Most of these have wooden reinforcements across the top to keep the shape and add extra security. When I made mine, it was just an experiment to see if I could do it. I didn't bother putting the wood pieces in. If I make another one, I'll add the wood pieces. Some sites actually have rules regarding how you carry cartridges. The way the ones from the Phipps and Witter wreck appear to be, you would lay them horizontally. You don't typically want to lay them loose when dealing with some historic sites, so I actually have a typical block like used for Revolutionary War and American Civil War. That said, the paper cartridges would have a little bit more powder than you'd need because you'd actually use some of it to prime the pan, and then you'd have your ball or shot on top of it. You'd fold it up, possibly use a little bit of glue, and it would be very quick and easy to load your musket. You wouldn't be using what's called an apostle, well, what we call in modern times an apostle. You typically see them with the English Civil War as well as some of the other conflicts of the time period. Even then, there was that concern about safety, especially with, in that case, using a matchlock. You had a lit fuse and you had yourself covered in gunpowder. Runs a risk of not ending well for anybody. But this was safer and it was more efficient. The Buccaneers used paper cartridges a lot. It was part of what made them very effective. Well, the question in particular was, did the Buccaneers make them themselves or did they purchase them? You'd make them yourself. There was no need to purchase it. It's a very simple process. All you need's a way to measure the powder, which most people with a musket at that time period would have, and you would need paper of some kind or a similar material. You could make them in the field. I believe SK Mellon has an account of them actually doing that. Do not quote me on that. I know one of the writers does. Another accessory you'd have is a powder flask. This one uses a modern tip. Again, some of the sites I deal with, I like to have a little bit of extra safety. I do want to eventually have one that with a correct spout for the time period. I'll post a picture. This one's made out of a coconut. You want to have... You often see brass parts on these. There's a reason for that. Brass does not spark, steel does. You don't want this thing, which is basically a bigger spicy baseball, having an issue on your side. Some people have even had issues with static electricity. That's why you see them made from things like horn, sometimes wood, or coconuts. Also with... in the black powder community, there's also a whole discussion about how to attach the various parts. In this case, this is friction fitted with a gasket made out of leather. In the time period, they might have nails, they might have any number of things. There's a lot of concern you have to have for safety, because although the federal government does not see these as firearms legally, there's a lot of safety risks involved that's worth thinking about. Even if you had paper cartridges, yes, you would have a powder flask of some kind. If you had a misfire, it would let you prime your pan again and try again. Let's start with weapons with long handles and move on from there. So, something that gets talked about a good bit are spears, pikes, lances, things like this. I do not have a boarding pike, so in this case I'm using my hewing spear from doing Viking stuff. Yes, there were giant blades like this. It was used for cutting and thrusting. Let's get away from that. Pikes were very popular in the 17th century. Lances were used by colonial Spanish cavalry and later Mexican cavalry well into the 19th century. It's a very practical, useful weapon. You're taking the full energy of the horse and rider and putting it into a tiny point. In the case of a pike, you are taking the full force of the horse and rider and putting it into a tiny point. On a ship, you're using it to repel boarders. So if somebody's trying to come over the side, you're doing that. If it's infantry versus infantry, you're trying to keep the other wall of pikemen away from your pikemen, or musketeers. In the case of bayonets, I know I talked about them before, but putting them in this context, you're doing the same thing. You're keeping the other guy away from you after you have fired your few volleys. You might be using it as a shock weapon to charge forward. On a ship, though, you're not getting much use out of it. Pikes become boarding pikes. You see them briefly, and then they disappear for a little bit, and then they come back. Kind of like the spicy baseballs. Spears, you see a very similar thing in military thinking. Even very recently in various conflicts, spears, pikes were issued to home defense units when firearms were not available. It's a very common weapon. We will likely see them. There might be battles in 1,000 years from now where we might see spears of some type used in some capacity. Were boarding pikes commonly used by pirates? No. Would they have existed? Yeah. Yeah. I can't think of any references of them being used. Again, it's something that comes about later on. Or earlier on. Depending which direction you want to go. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, axes are a very popular topic in the questions. They've happened on my videos, they've happened on Golden Gunpowder's videos. Boarding axes start to become a thing during this era. The problem is, there are very few examples we have of what they look like. I believe there is I forget if it's German or Scandinavian, I think there's also a Spanish depiction of one. A lot of what's commonly available to reenactors are the American Revolution style, and they have langets to protect the wood. Were there axes on ships at the time? Yes. The carpenter needed axes for general purpose around the ship. Cutting rigging, firefighting, axes were common. They were also very common trade items. A word that gets misused a lot, and this is even by historians, everybody's guilty of this one. If I asked you what's a pole axe, a lot of you are probably picturing an axe on the end of a pole, like a spear. In the time period, that was not typically what was called a pole axe. A pole axe is actually referring to this part. It could be a spike, it could be a hammer, it could also be, later on, a peace pipe. A peace pipe is technically a pole axe. The word pole in this context is referring to the head. It's adding emphasis to the head. It's not talking about a pole, it's talking about the head. That's why when we talk about pole axes in a medieval context or later medieval context, it's being talked about as being an anti-armor weapon. Something on a long stick, you reach a point where it's not that practical anymore. Something on a shorter stick, but with a lot of mass, that's practical against armor. Having a hammer makes a useful tool. Having a spike makes it a weapon. Also, this can be used as a tool. I've actually used this part more than this part randomly at events when setting up camp. It's very odd. You also have a regular axe blade. It's a multi-purpose tool and weapon. Trade axes varied a lot. We have a Biscayne axe, which the French were some of the first who made a purpose-made trade axe. The head is very similar to a modern generic hatchet. In fact, I've seen some people take a modern generic hatchet, do some reshaping, and use it as a Biscayne axe. Some, I've actually seen what we refer to as a halberd, various pole weapons with, I'm talking about a pole weapon, I am actually now talking about that. I've seen images of them being cut down, there's even accounts apparently of them being cut down, and that axe head being used as a trade item, because it's a fancy metal axe. Who wouldn't want that? You could trade that for all sorts of things. Was it practical? I mean, some of them, you have spikes, you have all sorts of different bits on them. Yeah, as a weapon, yeah, it would definitely have its uses. Mary Read and Anne Bonny in one of the images, they're pictured using a very similar axe. There's also several various images of indigenous cultures around the world that's supposedly what they were traded for something. Yeah, axes like that did exist in a time period. It looks fanciful. Was it practical? Not that much, but it would be a useful trade item. Most of your trade axes would be something like this. Just a basic head. You might have a pole, a spike, etc. You might not. It would just be a practical axe. It would be a good size. You could use it as a weapon, you could use it as a tool. Would pirates have had them? Yes. In fact, there's documentation of pirates using carpentry axes. Even a carpentry axe can still be a weapon. And we get into that when we talk about Viking things. A lot of medieval in general, a lot of your axes were multi-purpose. You could use it for working around your home, or if the local jarl asks for help, it becomes a weapon. You see the same thing happen with militia records. Even into the American Revolution, there's, oh, if you don't have a bayonet, bring your hanger. If you don't have a hanger, bring your hatchet or a tomahawk. Different phrases like that. They were very popular in the colonies, and again, it's a tool and a weapon. I actually don't carry mine around that much just because mine is double-headed, and we don't have many images of ways to carry them. Most of the time we see them carried, they're just stuffed in a belt or in somebody's hand. Transporting this in a car can be a little bit of a pain. That's why sometimes you might see me with this, just a piece of scrap leather I made into a cover. Is it historically documented? No, it doesn't need to be, because usually at the event it's off and this is placed somewhere where nobody's going to trip on it. Axes were used in the time period, and there were a lot of varieties. There's no specific one I can point to and be like, that's the axe to get. Oh, since I can actually mention where you can get axes, check with your local blacksmiths, bladesmiths. Typically, axe heads, because they tend to be made of a cheaper quality steels, things like that, you can get them, they're usually on the cheaper end of the offerings from blacksmiths and bladesmiths. So if you want to support some of your local businesses, that's a good way to do it. I know quite a few, and I really don't want to name any of them because I feel like if I forget somebody, I'm going to feel bad. So I might put some links in the description. Shop around. The ones that I'll list, I've either bought from them, know people who've bought from them, or consider them good friends. So, small businesses, send it their way. Which is a great segue into today's sponsor! Truth is, we don't actually have a paid sponsor. It's me. If you want to get us a paid sponsor, like, comment, subscribe, invite your friends to do the same, watch some of our videos, even dislike, comment that you hated it. I don't care. It gets the algorithm moving. And hopefully I will actually have a sponsor other than me one day. Anyway, let's see. I can set you up with a hat. I'm actually going to do a video where I am on how to shape hats and waterproof them. All that fun stuff. I have a very specific project I can't mention much about because I don't think the person who ordered it has announced it yet. But I will definitely be doing a video very soon on that. It's going to be a Buccaneer hat, by the way. Let's say here. Shirts. I do shirts. Jackets. I do jackets. This is a slop contract waistcoat. There's one behind me that I just finished. Breeches. This one's semi-slop contract. Hats. This is a nice fluffy winter hat. I don't think these were actually lined in the period with fur, but I did it because I wanted a warmer hat. It's based on several examples, one of which probably was lined. The ones that appear in the Navy pictures, I don't think were. But that's just a guess. It saved money. That's another shirt. Oh, another jacket. I also do trousers, too, if you're looking for those. And as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm probably going to do a specific video on this style of... this particular style. But yeah, made that too. For some reason, people who even know me on Facebook don't realize I am a maker. I do have a price list on the Crew the Fancy page, but I need to clarify, unless otherwise mentioned, a lot of those prices are very flexible on the cheaper side of things, because I like to post the worst case scenario as opposed to the better case scenario. And if you buy a bunch of things, I can usually cut you a break. I should note that I also do some later stuff, earlier stuff, and cosplay. So feel free to hit me up. If it involves a sewing machine, I will likely say no. Well, that's it from our sponsor. So, I was debating which to go with next. Since we're on the topic of wooden handles, sticks. Yes, sticks of varying kinds. Pieces of wood, clubs. They were used by pirates, sailors, etc. On merchant ships. This might be the only weapon you own. And why were sailors depicted with canes? Number one, it's a weapon. Number two, if you've been on a ship for a very long time, the one thing Pirates of the Caribbean gets right, in my opinion, is Jack Sparrow's swaying thing. Those of you who have been on boats for longer than a few minutes, you know what I mean. You walk onto the pier and you're, yeah. Honorable mention, if your Captain Kidd buckets were used. Alright. Fids, sometimes called marlin spikes, though technically the wooden ones are specifically fids. Marlin spikes were typically metal, and yes, they did appear. There is documentation specifically calling them marlin spikes and being metal from the Jamestown expedition. I don't know where the idea came from that metal ones did not exist. These were used for splicing rope. They were also used for creating holes in such things as sailcloth. And you could also use them if you needed a knot of a specific size. You could use this to adjust. Were these used as weapons? They could be. Field expedients. If you're a pirate reenactor, I actually do encourage you to have some of these. Several of these even. These were practical. They were used by sailors. These were a necessary tool in the age of sail. Would you use them as a weapon? There's a lot better options. These usually come up in conversation. Also, belaying pins. Belaying pins are part of the ship. They belong to the ship. It would be like taking the lug nuts off your car to throw them at somebody. Don't do that. The belaying pins are the same concept. They're part of the ship. They're a necessary part of the ship. If you had some spare and it was the only thing you could grab, yeah. Using that same logic, if you were a cook, you could probably grab some of your utensils of varying types. Which brings us to things that were used. I mentioned in my little talk about New York laws, yeah, I had to cut the tip off of this one to make sure it was within the proper length. If I, for any reason, was walking around the city and had this on me, I wanted to make sure it was safe. So, a lot of sailor knives do not have a point. That said, a lot of knives of the time period had a point. You can still use it as a slashing weapon. This is mainly for safety if you were climbing the rigging. You were also less likely to, in a fit of drunken anger, yeah. Butt knives were accessible. Sailors had them. Pirates had them. In the Buccaneer images, we see 2 or more knives in a sheath or scabbard. Tod Cutler actually makes a set that's very similar to this. It's fancier. Appears in Dutch images in the 17th century. His are marked for earlier, but it's the same style. This style gets repeated well into the 20th century. But yeah, you have multiple sizes of knives. If you're a cook, you'd have them. If you're a buccaneer or a hunter, you'd have them. It's just a useful tool. that can be a weapon. These I will actually give you a specific style to look for. Look for various trade knives. There are quite a few makers. Some of the ones that I might list below do make trade knives. Again, they're usually some of the cheaper things to get, and they are very practical. Mine are cheaper ones I had bought after my good ones decided to jump into the Chesapeake Bay. The only thing I lost, yep, including my pride, I think that went with that too. But, yeah, they were very practical, and if you carry them on your belt and you have them properly secured, you won't lose them in the Chesapeake Bay or any other body of water. I put them in a box thinking nothing would fall out of the box, and nothing did, until randomly when I was stepping onto the boat and the boat was rocking. I didn't even lose my balance. That was the worst part. They just, that slight pop of the boat moving in the waves caused them to fall out. They were family heirlooms. Yeah, I do plan on replacing the ones that I have eventually with some better ones. With a lot of these things, there's things that I want to replace, but I haven't found quite the style I want yet. I'm very particular. Those you actually do end up using around the house. If you're somebody on a budget and you want, like, man, I want a pirate weapon, if you get trade knives, things like that, you can actually use them around your kitchen, and they are very useful knives. Just flat out, in general, they were useful in the time period, and they are useful today. The shape is very familiar. I'm going to have some pictures floating around throughout this whole thing. Take a good look at it. You might find things to either fill the space, but it would be better if you go to a good maker. Let's talk about swords. I am not a sword guy, alright? I have swords only for the practical reason of I'm a pirate. That's why you don't really see fancy swords with me. This is a hunting hanger. If you notice, this one does not have the cover that you see on some of the later ones. It just has a simple piece of metal. It was designed to prevent moisture from getting into the scabbard. You find these in plenty of images. You see similar ones in images. Be careful with some of the images, by the way, though, because some of them get very fanciful. But look at some of the artifacts. This style did not change much from the 17th century into the 19th century. There's little details, like I said, about... There's actually a bit of a cup on some of the later ones. The designs change. This one I actually repurposed from a later one. Went with a different grip, changed the grip shape, and added a grotesque. You see very similar things. Some of the German ones will have rivets. Some of them look very similar to messers. In fact, some of the messers, some of the suppliers aren't too far off from some of the hunting hangers that you'd find in the time period. These were a practical tool and a weapon. You could use it for hunting, you can use it as a machete. That's another word that I need to bring up. Machete sometimes gets used in the documents of the time. Machetes can refer to something like this. Machetes could also, depending on context, refer to something like this. When we think of machetes as tools today, you gotta remember, we're not talking about factory-made sheet steel and just cutting it. No, it would be smith-made, and it would, even the ugliest machete of the time period would look a lot better than some of the things that we have today. And again, look at the blade shape. There would also be very specific cutting tools, some from different cultures. basically a big knife. That's the best way to describe it. Now, we need to talk about words briefly. Scala Gladiatoria, Matt Easton did an excellent video on the term cuddle-axe. 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 Guess what word comes from that? Cutlass. Guess what this is sometimes called? A cutlass. This can also be called a hanger. And it can also be called a machete. We see these words get thrown around a lot. People want to add a lot of things to them. Unless there are specific details, there is very little we can add. On the topic of hanger, these are marketed sometimes as hangers. Sometimes a certain time period's applied to them. This one I've modified quite a bit. This was marketed as a pirate captain's hanger. I believe this one's from Windlass. There's the shape. There are several examples from the late 17th century, early 18th century, which have this overall look. You also see them later. There's a lot of variety going on. This has a fairly thin blade. It's not a chunky blade like the hunting hanger. It's got more of a saber style blade. It's a very practical basic sword. You see some different hilt styles. You see the scalloped hilts. A lot of those sadly have been discontinued. I don't know why. There are a few makers floating around that do make them. There's one that sometimes pops up on eBay who they don't look like they'd be good quality, but they actually are amazing quality. I've got to see one in person. The guy just needs to take better pictures. He's worked for several big name movies. If I can get his information, I will actually post it below. He hasn't posted anything on eBay recently, but he apparently is still making them. But he's a good source. I think he's just above $100 on pricing, and it's good quality. This one's from Windlass. It does not have any way to hook it onto a belt. I had to add a piece myself. I don't know why they didn't add a piece. It really wouldn't have saved much manufacturing costs. There's a lot of extra that they did that they could have just done that instead. I changed out the grip material because I did not like the leather that they used. I went with better leather. A lot of the stuff you're going to find that you might have to do some work on. But overall, it's one of my favorite blades. This one's using a baldric. This style is just a very basic 17th century baldric style. Baldrics and belts, you see them throughout the time period. In this case, this is actually cowskin, cowhide. This is based on some of the descriptions of the Buccaneers. This one, I actually have a pouch that goes with it, which for some reason I do not have it over here. I probably should have had it for when I talked about the accoutrements, but yeah. Belts also tend to be a lot smaller, except the French ones. The French ones have a slightly wider, thinner, well, actually a taller buckle about the same width. But I mean, this is a very basic buckle for the time period. You're only looking about an inch and a half. You're not really looking at some of the wide buckles we see in pirate movies. A lot of the vendors offer. No, these were simple belts. The buckles do vary a lot more than I think I said in my one video. You see some variety, but overall it's somewhat this shape and overall style. If you look at the Buccaneer images, it's a thin belt. And that thing that they have above it's actually a mosquito net. It's not a sash. I know I'm talking about weapons on this, but part of the accoutrements. Now this one's actually my favorite one to carry at events. This is a half basket backsword. If it had a second edge to it, this is only a single edge, if it has second edge, it would be a half basket broadsword. It also would typically have a wider blade. I love this one because it's got some of the generic features of blades of the 17th century. It's got the hilt looks very similar. I love that they added the screws right there. Like, you see this style. I don't like that there's no thumb ring. There's usually a little bit more going on over here. And a lot of them you will see some sort of a solid piece. Sometimes it's perforated over the top of the hilt. This one's from Topeka. This one, you can get them pretty cheap on Cult of Athena. I like it as a basic, ugly, colonial era hanger. The quality is awful. The quality is historically accurate. I mean, some of these features, like, you can see hammer marks here. Like, I want to see that on some... I want more makers to make ugly swords. There are some actual practical issues with this one, though. Number one, they made their scabbard probably a good 3 inches too long. I actually cut this down, and it's still too long. Like, it shouldn't do that. Originally, like, it was actually... it could flop all the way over. That's not good for the tip. It's not good for the longevity. Eventually, I'm probably just going to completely come up with a new scabbard sheath for this. I know there's a difference between a scabbard and a sheath. I keep using them interchangeably. The thing is, I'm not sure if I want a... This is... Even though this is supposed to be a scabbard, it's... I mean, it's... There's... These other ones, they're made out of a lot better quality leather, which keeps their shape. Even though they're technically made like a sheath, they have the firmness of a scabbard. The other issue I do like their clip. Their clip is very nice. If you... Distal taper exists somewhat, but if you look, I don't know if you can tell, the grind of it is very uneven. It is, like, right here, there's a fat part, and there's, you feel it wiggle. Like, it holds together very well. The wood quality is also awful. Like I said, eventually there's a lot more I want to do with this. I might actually, I mean, I'm eventually going to have one made to my specifications. I just got to get around to a maker that can give me a good price and possibly work on a trade. That's one thing a lot of makers do in this hobby because they need things. So some of us who make things, we do take trades. So, if you're a maker wanting to get into this hobby and you can provide something to it, you might be able to get kit just for what you do. But all these styles of swords would have been used in the time period. There also would be small swords. Small swords require a little bit more skill. People routinely ask about rapiers. Rapiers in English context stopped being a very popular thing right around the time of the English Civil War. What you will find are small swords with rapier blades. I've actually got the chance to hold one, inspect it. Amazing piece. The guy who bought it didn't even know what it was until I actually looked at it, researched the maker marks. Yeah, it was a small sword with a rapier blade. It would have been cut down a little bit. New Spain, you would see rapiers hang on for a little bit longer. You'd also see the accompanying daggers. Mostly in the English colonies, you'd see, I shouldn't even say English, in the Dutch colonies as well. With the Dutch, you would see various types of hangers of the types I've shown. Blades vary. Some were refitted from older blades. Some were new production. Some were apparently, just from what I've read in some of the accounts, some were even made by blacksmiths. You typically don't go to a blacksmith for a sword. The quality was not the greatest, which is why I said again, I'm not too upset about the quality on my back sword. In fact, I like it because it's ugly, except for the features I said were a little... can't really look past. But if you're a sword maker, if you're friends with them, please, please get them to make ugly swords. Most of the pirate swords that are commonly available online are not correct on any stretch of it. You'd be much better off with, I believe it's called a musician sword. They were used during the American Revolution. That style is very similar to what appears in some of the images of the buccaneers, of sailors during the 17th century. Some of the paintings even, like, it looks very similar. It's got, I believe it has a bird's head or a grotesque. I forget off the top of my head. I will post a picture. That's a great option. A lot of your cup hilts and some of your, they're more of like a 19th century style cutlass hilt. Those were not used in the time period. The blades might be right, but usually the quality is not something you'd want to even use as a tool. One thing I like about Cult of Athena, they say if something's battle ready. I do question them on that backsword, but they will update things if you have concerns. Their customer service is really good. Trying to think here. But yeah, there's not that many good options right now, but there are some that are out there. I was not planning on this being a review video, but it came up. I know people are going to ask, where can I get something like that? One of the people who does offer this, actually, they offer all of these. They're a little bit pricier. It's the same ones as I have. They're a little bit pricier. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe them. They do offer them. I can't link them because they also offer some of the other things that I have shown today. Facebook, I could actually link them, but on Facebook, if you're already on our Facebook, you know who they are. For some reason, they're allowed to have a Facebook presence, even though they do sell those things. I'm hoping I covered everything. I know somebody's going to ask a question at some point in time that I didn't think to answer. We will be doing a similar video to this. Actually, it'll probably be me and Richard sitting down and talking about this stuff. So if you've got canon questions, feel free to ask. If you've got any more questions on weapons, feel free to ask. I'll probably do another follow-up video. I might do some, like I've said before, I want to do some more specific videos. Also, I'm back. I don't know how regular the content's going to be for a little bit. If you go visit our video sponsor, Winky Face, you might be able to help us become more regular on doing our content. I will probably I actually might do an actual live stream talking about pirate clothing. That I can do. Just don't ask me any question where I have to pick up one of these. I might have them conveniently displayed behind me where I can point, but don't ask me to pick one up on a live feed. If I wanted to get banned, I would actually test it out with a Nerf gun just to see how the algorithm works. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, subscribe, share, comment. If you hated it, comment. Take care. Have an awesome day.